All right, well, I want to thank everyone for coming. You could be doing anything with your time, and I'm excited that you're here with me and with us to kick off this session series. We entitled it Ukraine for the Curious. When I created this series, and I came up with the idea of doing this, when I pitched this to the Methodist congregation, there was a certain Bible verse that came to mind that inspired me, where it says in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11, take no part in the worthless deeds of evil and darkness, instead expose them. And I think that's very appropriate for what has happened with this full-scale invasion and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so what I thought I was inspired to do was to really just educate people and really have them learn more about what's happening there, and really just provide a forum for people to be educated. And to also ask questions. We encourage questions. I don't want to be your anesthesiologist for the evening. So feel free to ask questions, and as we're going to cover some really, I think, interesting information. I first want to talk about what we're going to do with this series and kind of give you a preview of kind of what we're going to talk about, okay? So we're going to talk about the historical perspective. This is the largest land war in Europe since World War II. And when you have a conflict of this size, it comes from somewhere. This is not something that just happens, right? And when you have a major war like this, it's not something that just sort of happened on the fly. It's something led up to it, or things led up to it. So we're going to talk about the historical perspective of this. We're going to talk about, we're going to do a military update. We're going to give you a sense of kind of how we got here militarily, what happened in February with the full-scale invasion, started in February of 2022, and kind of go through kind of what's happened and give you an update up to the latest in terms of what's happened on the battlefield and what to expect, and some analysis of this. We're going to spend a particular amount of time, and Pastor, you alluded to this in the sermon on Sunday. We're going to talk about the Russian persecution of Christians in Ukraine, in occupied Ukraine. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to spend a particular amount of time on that, because it is something that is near and dear to my heart, and as as circumstance would have it, the Baptists have had a particularly rough go in Ukraine, in Russian occupied Ukraine. We're going to get into that and talk specifically about that, but it's not specific to the Baptists. All faiths, including the Jewish faith and mosques, it doesn't really matter. The Russians really have had a systemic program to suppress and oppress the expression of faith and practicing of faith, religious faith in Ukraine, other than the Russian Orthodox Church. We'll talk about that as well. We're going to talk about genocide. We're going to talk about war crimes, things that have happened that have been perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine. We're going to talk specifically about this, and unfortunately in the digital age, this is the most, I'd say, not well covered, but most documentable, if that's not really a word, of genocide that in recent memory, and perhaps ever. People that study genocide for a living say this is obvious genocide on multiple levels: cultural genocide, human genocide, and so this is something that we're going to talk about in detail. We're going to talk about the involvement of the liberal democracies of the world, so the U.S., Europe, Asian countries, all of the freedom-loving League of Nations. What are the countries doing to support Ukraine? We're going to talk about that in detail. And then we're going to wrap up with how you can help your fellow humans, because I don't want this to just be an academic exercise. I want it to be something where people are moved to get involved, even if it doesn't necessarily have to involve money. There are so many ways that people can get involved, and so that's something that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about advocacy, and I suspect that by the time we get to that point in the material, you're going to be coming up to me, as the Methodists were, asking me, okay, well, how this is all really interesting, but what can we do to kind of help, improve the situation? And that, I suspect, will be your feeling as we go through this content here. What I thought I would start with is a quick introduction of our panelists here, because one of the things that I heard in the pilot that we did with the Methodist Church is that they particularly valued the expertise of, I'm gonna get your opinions afterward, what you think of the pictures I chose of you to import into my slides. So I want you to have a sense, because, you know, as Providence would have it, and I have to say, I did not know that these people would live here until I started this project. And it was actually thanks to Andrea Coolish here, who is here also, and I'll have her introduce herself as we go through this. And she let me know that we had access to these people in Western North Carolina. So it's God's providence that we actually had access to these great people. So we'll go through that as well. Mr. John Culp here is the son of a United Methodist pastor who served the Western North Carolina Conference. He grew up he lived in Silva, Asheville, Greensboro, and Charlotte. Spent a lot of time in Lake Junaluska in the Waitsville area. He is a retired United States Army Lieutenant Colonel. Started out as in the enlisted ranks as an explosive ordnance disposal technician, EOD, bomb tech. He spent the bulk of his Army career in infantry and special forces assignments. He went to EOD school in the late 1990s to prepare him for 3 missions as a United Nations Arms Inspector in Iraq. Upon retirement from the Army, he joined the CIA and worked with their explosives and worked in their explosives and weapons program as a staff officer and contractor, training with and working with foreign bomb squads. Until he retired in 2019. He deployed 5 times to Afghanistan and 5 times to Iraq. And after the kickoff of the full-scale invasion by Russia into Ukraine in February 2022, he worked with an organization called Bomb Tech Without Borders and worked to conduct operations in Ukraine to provide training for explosive removal and explosive awareness. We're going to talk about mining and demining. We're going to talk about that extensively. So he's traveled to Ukraine so far 5 times, and actually you guys are headed back coming up in the next few weeks here. And along with his wife Donna, they have sponsored the visit of Ukrainian officials to North Carolina and Virginia and talk about veterans topics, and they continue their efforts in support explosive removal and demining efforts. Donna Culp, his wife, was born in Michigan, the daughter of a career Air Force non-commissioned officer. She was an occupational therapist by background and later joined the United States Air Force. She served 6.5 years in the U.S. Air Force, leaving as a captain. And after retirement from civilian work as an occupational therapist, she also joined the CIA as a logistics officer. And she worked to retire from the agency in 2016. She is the former president of the Western North Carolina chapter of the Military Officers Association of America, and continues to be very active in United States Veteran Affairs in Western North Carolina. She also has worked with Bomb Tech Without Borders since the kickoff of the full-scale invasion in 2022, and served in medical and logistics roles, and has made a number of trips to Poland and Ukraine, and has also been involved in establishing rehabilitation center for Ukrainian veterans, and has been involved in just advocating for United States veterans, as well as supporting presentations like this regarding Ukraine. And then Mr. Jim Green over here. Jim is a former United States naval officer. He is also a former NATO diplomat and an expert in international security cooperation. He has over 30 years of association with Ukraine, beginning in March of 1991. He was around, he has some fascinating stories regarding the collapse of the Soviet Union and the corresponding rise of independent Ukraine. Just incredible. He also has worked at NATO headquarters, both military as well as political headquarters in Brussels. After leaving the Navy in 2002, he moved to Kyiv, where he worked in a project at a leading Ukrainian think tank, and then he was appointed chief of mission for NATO for Ukraine. He was there for the 2004 Orange Revolution, which we will talk about. He was there firsthand and was at the forefront, at the vanguard of NATO Ukraine cooperation, and also as Ukraine started to reform its military into a Western-style security operation. He's returned to the U.S. in 2009, and he's led multiple multinational teams from government, industry, and civil society to better understand security challenges. He remains an active contributor to expert dialogue and civic initiatives regarding NATO and Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression. Jim is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and also is a graduate of the London School of Economics. And he served as a naval officer for 12 years with a background in naval aviation and international military cooperation, and he operates a independent consultancy which specializes in international security. So my bio is actually nowhere near as grandiose as either of these people. Okay, so I'm a medical device guy. I live in Weaverville. I've been here since 2017. I am a co-host of the Maria Report, which is a live space. Think of it as like a global radio calling show on Twitter. And so it runs 24/7, and we have a lot of volunteer co-hosts and it's a place where we cover the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and so we do fundraising, we have guests that come in with particular expertise, we do military updates, we have segments, recurring shows that talk about genocide, talk about cybersecurity, talk about general geopolitical topics. We have military analysts that come on and give their views and take questions and provide commentary. And so it's a great community of people. We have people from all over the world. Actually, I will be co-hosting tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern until 1 a.m. I was co-hosting the other night with a guy from Australia. There's people from all over the world, and we have anywhere from any given time, we may have 150 to 400 people in the room from all over the world, participating and mostly just listening, but we do have people come up and ask questions or make a comment or express an opinion. And so I encourage you all to join us in the Maria Report. And I do a lot of legislative advocacy, and I get involved in fundraising and education efforts like this. This is something that I'd like to see cascade into a larger effort, potentially online, maybe using Zoom technology to get into large audiences to get information about Ukraine. One of the things that I before we get started on the substantive, I want to really get a sense of kind of where everyone's head's at when it comes to Ukraine. So one question I had was that, so give me a sense of kind of your knowledge of this. So how many people are like, okay, so I'm aware that there's a war in Ukraine, I know the Russia and Ukraine are involved, but I don't really know much else, and this is something that I just want to learn more about. How many are kind of in that bucket? Okay. Okay, and then how many people are like, yeah, all right, I've been following this, and I kind of have an opinion on kind of how it's going or where this came from, and I just want to have kind of I want to learn more and maybe have my preconceived notions confirmed or maybe changed a little bit. How many are in that bucket? Okay, all right, and then what I also want to do is kind of get a sense of, is there anything specific that you want us to make sure that we cover over the course of this session? Are there burning questions that you would like to make sure that we answer as something that's kind of bugging you in the back of your mind as to, I'd like to learn about this, or what this aspect of the war. Anything that you want to make sure that we cover, and just anybody feel free to raise your hand and express what your question might be. Okay?
Hey, Brian, everybody's afraid that Russia's gonna hit that nuclear button.
Okay.
Can we talk about that?
Sure, we can talk about that. Anything else? Okay, Our experience with this is that once we get into the content, we actually do get a lot of questions and a lot of, a comment or testimonial from one of our panelists may spark a question. That's very common, so I want this to be free flowing, so feel free to stop us if you're not sure about something, maybe you have a question, you're not understanding it, or if you just want to ask a question, please do that. One of the things I also talk about is you're not going to get the story of what's happening in this war by going to the news network for a variety of reasons. Number one, they've moved on to the 2024 election. That's their business model, right? They want to drive ratings, they have a business to run. So, yeah, they'll give some incidental coverage to Ukraine, maybe have a segment or two, but in general, it's all elections all the time on the news network for the most part. And so I have some resources here that I recommend to you that to follow. They're in the handouts as well. In particular, the Institute for the Study of War. That is, if you're looking strictly for, mostly for a military update, that's one of the best sites to go to. It will give you, and it really can get as high level or as detailed as you want with this stuff. So, complete with maps, complete with analysis and stuff. So I recommend the Institute for the Study of War. It's understandingwar.org is a great source. There's also other sources as well that I've listed here. But yeah, so I think that's where you're going to find your information, your more detailed information, and if you're following this. But the news networks really generally their coverage is sparse at best, which is kind of odd given that, again, this is the largest land war in Europe since World War II, and the geopolitical implications of this war are significant, as we'll talk about. These two sites in particular are good sources for information for, in particular, the RussiaTorturesChristians.org. That's actually started by a former Republican House staffer who actually now lives in Ukraine. I actually just talked to him the other night on Friday, and so he is a Christian, and he was moved by what is happening to Christians there, and so he's been documenting this stuff and collating it and putting it on this website, RussiaTorturesChristians.org. And actually it has been, obviously given his congressional background, he's been advocating on Capitol Hill for U.S. aid and really trying to get people to understand what is happening to Christians in Ukraine by Russians. And so, because I highly recommend that site in particular to kind of, it's good source material for information regarding what's happening over there. One of the things also that, we're in a digital age now, and so we're able to get information that's in the public domain that, that you don't have to rely on the news network. Anyone with a credit card can actually now get satellite imagery. I don't know if you knew that, but you can actually go and purchase satellite images over different parts of the world, and they call it this field open source intelligence, where there are people who actually stare at these data sources, whether it's Russian Telegram channels talking about the war, whether it's satellite imagery, whether it's intercepts of other channels, NASA data that's looking at fires where there's been airstrikes or bomb strikes, and you can actually infer what's happening in the battlefield by some of this open source intelligence information. So that's where, some of this propaganda that's been put out there, no, there hasn't been killing, no, there aren't really mass graves over by Mariupol, yeah, there are. So if we can see them, so yeah, I mean, it's not going to be something that equivalent to what you would get at the Pentagon or national security level, but it's enough where you can actually look at and infer what's happening and get real information. So it is something that I would recommend. That's where a lot of this information comes from when you start talking about military updates, that kind of stuff. So I want to introduce Ukraine itself to you. It is the largest largest country in Europe by landmass, by surface area. It is a country, so you see kind of this circle right here. So what you'll see is this is in the eastern part of Europe. You see the Black Sea down here on the south. You have Moldova, you have Belarus. Belarus is sort of they have like a Russian puppet government there, Belarus. Then you've got the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Those are NATO members. Then you have Sweden, Finland up to the north here. Here's Stockholm, Sweden, here's Finland. This is all Russia, this Russia border right here. Then you have Georgia to the south. Again, you have the Black Sea, and then you have, next you have Poland to the west. So Lviv, this city Lviv is actually on right near the border with the Poland. And then you have Warsaw, and then you have the Romania, Serbia, Hungary, Slovakia. So just kind of give you a sense of the geography here. All right, and then we kind of zoom in a little closer. And so again, as we see, so this is kind of where we could get a little bit of a closer view of Ukraine. And so you have certain key cities that we're going to talk about on a recurring basis. So I'll start with the Black Sea right here. So you have Odessa, you have Mykolaiv, you have Crimea, which is also part of Ukraine, although it was invaded in 2004. We're going to talk about that. And then you have Kyiv, which is the capital right there. You have Kharkiv on the right there, which is in the northeast, which is in the north. And you have east, Donetsk and Luhansk. We're going to talk about those cities and those oblasts. Oblast is like state in the United States. If you hear me talk about oblast, that is roughly equivalent to a state in Ukraine. And actually in Russia, they call that what they call oblast too. Sumy and Cherniv on the northern side, north and northeast of Kyiv. And then you have Lviv right here on the western side. They're going out towards the Polish border. So Odessa is on the south on the Sea of Azov. You're going towards the Black Sea. Mariupol, we're going to talk about that on the east. That's also on the coast. So that will give you kind of a sense of some of the key cities and kind of the geography. And so we're going to talk, when we start talking about, the military and the full-scale invasion, you'll get a sense of kind of what's happened and what's happening where. And lately, actually, with the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, which happened this month, this is Kursk right there, that's a city, and so the Kursk Oblast is right here. So this is where the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive actually into Russian territory, and that happened this month. And actually, Belgorod also, Belgrade Oblast, there's actually some information that potentially there are Ukrainian forces pushing into that oblast as well. So a lot of kinetic action going on in Russia, which is not the case even when we finished our series with the Methodists. So that content needs to be updated. Prior to the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia, there were 45 million people in Ukraine. So if you subtract out Crimea, it's 41 million people. So, so when people talk about that this is a little war, it's not significant, it's the size of Texas and it's got over 40 billion people. So, I understand that Gaza and, Israel and that conflict, that had a lot of headlines in the news. But we like to say in the Marie Report, there are hundreds of Gazas happening on a regular basis, on a weekly basis in Ukraine. So that's just to give you a sense of the scale of this conflict and the number of people that are involved. It is often said that Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and where that comes from is that they, as it implies, they have a very large agricultural export industry. Even their flag is, you have the blue that represents the blue sky, and then you have the yellow, which represents just wheat. Sunflowers. Yeah. So you wheat and sunflowers. Yeah. So they do a lot of exports to Europe, and they also do a lot of food exports to North Africa, and to Africa, and particularly the countries in North Africa. And so when people talk about, well, why do we need to care? It's just Ukraine. It's just, what's the significance of it? Well, strictly think about it. When you have no food in North African countries, what do you get? You get anarchy, and you get governments overthrown, and you get chaos in international markets. So that's something to consider. You get famine. Can get famine. Also, Ukraine has a very large industrial base. They have a lot of, they're famous for machinery, technical components, a lot of electronics, a lot of IT infrastructure there. Ukraine is a big exporter of fertilizer to all countries all over the world. And so when you think about food security, and you think about economies of the world, in the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere, to have that go offline or be subjugated by Russia would have world economic implications. Also, Ukraine is the largest manufacturer of supplier of noble gases. These are important for chip manufacturing, for semiconductor fabrication. So the chips in your phone, the chips in your computer, the chips in our cruise missiles, the chips in our electronic warfare apparatus. Some of this domestic chip manufacturing, over 90% of the krypton gas used in that process comes from Ukraine. So think about what would happen if that went offline, and what would that implications be for our industry, and also our security, because we're in a digital age. A lot of our weaponry is actually driven by electronic infrastructure. So something to consider implications of that. Some of this stuff, the second best source is China. So I'll let you do the implications there. Okay, well, if Russia takes it offline and your next best source is China, that's probably not a good place to be. So it's something to consider, that if there are geopolitical and geoeconomic implications for Ukraine going offline and being subjugated by Russia. So how did we get here? So I'm going to take you back to what's called first of all, let's go. It was one of the Methodist attendees at the last at the pilot session that we did. One of the things she said in the evaluation was that she always thought that Ukraine was always part of Russia, or part of the Soviet Union. That these were always one and the same, and that's not the case. And that was not intended to be the case by the people in Ukraine. I only went back to the 1920s. The people that are really studied this history, they go back centuries where this stuff is going on, past the Bolsheviks, earlier than that, where there were repeated attempts to subjugate Ukrainian culture, history, language, and economy. All this stuff is always, it's been a thing where Russians have tried to essentially put down and to dominate the people that live in what is now Ukraine. So even in the formation of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainians went down fighting. They actually fought a war against the Russians, and they lost, and were then the Ukrainian People's Republic was assimilated into what was known as the USSR, the Soviet Union. So under threat of force, they were put into the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, you probably heard, he was a very nice guy. A lot of people, he killed a lot of people. Very one of the worst authoritarian dictators that we've seen, certainly in Europe and Eastern Europe. And so he instituted a mass political repression, intimidation, torture, rape, and executing intellectuals. There was an organized campaign to subjugate the Ukrainian people. And as part of that campaign, there was something called the Holodomor. Holodomor. I know I've screwed that up before. I need to write a flashcard on that. Holodomor. So that, it was a man-made famine. So essentially it's like, we're going to basically starve these people as part of our effort to put them under our thumb. And so they essentially, it hurt a lot of the rural villagers in Ukraine the worst, the most, and it was a man-made famine. And so this picture is actually from that point where you have somebody just drop dead on the street, just due to starvation. And we won't ever know the actual precise amount of people that died in this famine, but most estimates seem to circle around just short of 4 million people. 4 million people just starved to death just because, Stalin, wanted to subjugate the Ukrainians and used it as food insecurity as a weapon against supposedly people that he was responsible for leading.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is where I'll share with the group. When John and I were working with Bobcats Without Borders, we had a linguist. She teaches English as a second language, and she shared with us that her family suffered through this Holodomor, and when they finally got through it and to the other side, there were only 39 members of her family and extended family who survived that. Imagine that happening here to your family. So that's an upfront and personal account of how that affected one individual and her family.
So I guess the message is that because when you went to Ukraine, you would actually talk to people who still, talk about this. So it's not a historical data point that, people are just generally aware of. This is something that they are acutely aware of. And to this day, this is something that they carry in their psyche, it's part of who they are, is that, they know that this happened to them. And the amount of death that happened there. So it's not something that's forgotten by Ukrainians at all, even though it happened in the 1930s. So we're going to fast forward to December of 1991. The Soviet Union fell. I remember because I was in school. I was at Duke on campus, and then there was a dude that walked into our conference room and said, "The biggest party in the world is in Germany right now." And so we basically, shortly after the fall, the Ukrainians okay, they overwhelmingly voted, understandable given their history, like Poland, like all these other countries, and that were former Warsaw Pact countries, we want to be our own independent country. So they voted overwhelmingly for independence and became a sovereign state, and the United States recognized them as an independent country in December of 1991. Any memories to share on that specific time frame before we get to the Budapest Memorandum?
Yeah, I can speak specifically to that. Were you there? You were there about the same time, Jim?
91, 92.
I was there 89 to 92, so yeah, we overlapped a bit. I was in the Air Force. I was an occupational therapist.
Does it keep messing up?
It keeps missing a beat.
Huh.
Here we go. Anyway, during that period of time, from 89 to 92.
Here, I think you've got to cut it in court somewhere.
I don't know, maybe.
Maybe that one will work.
Yeah. There we go, we'll share this one. I was there from 89 to 92, and my regular duty was I was an occupational therapist specializing in orthopedic and neurological rehabilitation. My additional duty as assigned, and in the military, everybody has that additional duty as assigned. I was the chief of patient retrieval, and our team was the team that went out to the casualty collection points, bringing the wounded and the dead, bringing them where they needed to go for, their next step of care. And during this time, we were on alert, and our team's duty was that if the wall didn't come down peacefully, when President Reagan said, "Gorbachev, tear down this wall," if that didn't go peacefully, what we were prepared for was to evacuate Americans. And what that means is every family had one suitcase with their important papers and whatever else they could put in there. And that was it. One suitcase per family. And our team was assigned the duty that everybody who could not be discharged from the hospital on an outpatient basis, if they couldn't be discharged, then it was our job to transport them to the emergency evacuation point. And then, once we completed that task, we were to join the other evacuation teams and continue helping evacuate Americans. And then once that was completed, then what we were to do was be prepared for being on the front line. So if that wall had not gone down peacefully, we would have had the Soviets rolling in on top of us. And I've talked to several other veterans who were stationed in Berlin, and they were stationed in the Fulda Gap, and that was their job, was to provide that first line of defense. And many of them have told me, they said, you know, what the Soviet military used to be, it's kind of a shadow of itself nowadays, but back then, they could have rolled right over us, and I wouldn't even be able to be here today to share that with you. And then when the wall did come down, one of the things that we experienced was that we saw these people who had been separated from families. Families were completely divided. Some of the family members were on the western side, some families were on the eastern side. And it wasn't until after that Soviet Union fell that some of these families were reunited for the first time in decades. But at first, it was a very joyful occasion. Imagine that. It was joyful. We watched the news, we saw it. But what happened next was once they got from East Germany, I'm speaking of just East Germany, when they got from East Germany to West Germany, it was like going from black and white to living color. Because when that wall was built, time stopped for those people. They were a time capsule. And then when they saw that the rest of the world had moved on, their first reaction was, what, did you forget about us? Did you even know we were here? Was it anybody trying to help us? Yes, we were. It just took time. It just took time. And no more time, can be allowed for any of this to happen again. And when the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the first words that came out of my mouth was, I said, those people cannot be another West and East Berlin. They cannot be forgotten. They cannot, must not be forgotten. And that is part of the reason, and you'll hear the rest of it later, that's part of the reason why I'm here with you tonight. And I thank you for taking the time, because I know you'd probably rather be home watching Netflix or squeezing out some more sunlight out of the day to paw around in the garden or whatever. But thank you for being here, because I know many of us in this room remember those times. We remember those days. We remember Walter Cronkite and talking about all of that. So that is something to keep in mind. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Brian. Did you want to say something, Jim? Because you were there from 91 to 92, right?
I was. I think that, maybe the thing that, I can.
Oh, no, use that.
Okay, I'll use this. I'm usually able to project fairly well. I guess I would just say, as you're thinking about this, today and other days about what's happening there, it's really important to think about, it can be helpful to put it in the big picture. Now, my great-grandfather was a Baptist missionary to China. They went there in the 1880s. And my grandfather his son was a Baptist missionary in China, and then had to stop because of depression and war, other things. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of what's happened on that side of the world. And today, the largest organization in China is the Christian church. There are more Christians than communists in China, despite repression. Ukraine, we think about religion, we think about Baptists in Ukraine. People think about missionaries going into the Soviet Union. But that's not how the Baptist church came to Ukraine. The first churches were made already around the time of the Civil War. here. So as Baptists were going and being oppressed in what's today Germany, and some were fleeing in England, some were fleeing to America, others were fleeing east and made their own communities there. Germans first, and then it quickly spread to the local Ukrainian population. By the time that my great-grandfather was in China in the 1880s and 1890s, there were 300,000 Baptists in Ukraine. And it became the center of the Baptist movement and of various, the first Baptist convention in Ukraine was in something like 1908, in Russia at that point. It's like 1908 in Kiev. And of course there were horrific repression of Baptists and all Christians during Soviet times. But what do we know about repression in Christianity, right? It doesn't destroy it. So by the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, there were about 750,000 Baptists in Ukraine. It's about half the total. And what was amazing to me when I was in the Soviet Union, so I was, without going into too many details, a student, graduate student in Moscow as the Soviet Union was collapsing for about a year. And what stunned me was how many people I met who were kind of, I would say, normal members of the Communist Party. People who had to join because if you got to a certain point in your career, if you were going to be the director of a working group at an institute, or if you were going to be a police major, or if you were going to be a head of faculty or a department head or chair or even deputy chair in a university, you had to be a member of the party. Everyone had to be a member of the party. And what shocked me is how many of these people I met who were baptized, usually by their grandmothers, and many had never been told. Now, obviously, the Baptists weren't baptized as children, right? But so many from other denominations were baptized as children by their grandmothers and then told when the Soviet Union collapsed, you're a Christian. And that, to me, one of the things to realize is that the extent to which the truth of that, and the truth of the church and what it carries and the faith has flowed through this really difficult area for such a long time. So the stories, we're very fortunate here in this part of Western North Carolina to be very connected to the church abroad and mission work. And just remember that mission work has been in the area of Ukraine today. It's not just recent. It goes back at least 150 years, even more.
May I speak just a second to what Donna was talking about? My husband and I were at the wall, and we were able to go into East Berlin. And it was just like you said. It was like going from a coloring book to a black and white movie. And the cars were all wooden frames, and the only reason that we were able to go was because I had a very high-ranking member of the Air Force in my family. But we saw the Pope's Revenge. Are you familiar with the Pope's Revenge? It was just, we saw people sitting in lawn chairs looking for their loved ones. It was quite amazing, but I just wanted to interject that part.
I use the microphone because I know that there might be some impaired hearing members in the group. I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to hear. Yeah, absolutely. And, there was a doctor I worked with who was an orthopedic surgeon who one day I ran across him and he was scurrying about trying to get some thises and thates, and I said, looks like you're gonna have a party. He said, we're having a family reunion. I said, a family reunion in Germany? His family was one of those families that was separated, that got divided when all of that took place. And because he was stationed in Germany, he said, I'll host this. He said, and what's crazy is, I'm not married. I don't have anybody to help me with this. I said, recruit a few people, they'll help you with it. But he was just so emotional and excited about this opportunity to be able to broker this reunion of family members who were coming from different places in the United States and from former Eastern Bloc, Germany. And so, yeah, that sense of deep connection. If you don't have any sense of humanity or a heart, you can't imagine. Just put yourself in that place and what you're describing, yeah.
Before seeing it on this slide, who had heard of the Budapest Memorandum? Okay. Well, this is instructive, right? That alone tells you a lot. So, after the fall of the Soviet Union, what do you think the United States government and the Defense Department and the State Department were worried about when the Soviet Union collapsed and fell apart? What do you think they were worried about? Nuclear weapons, right? Because if you're in an environment which is very dynamic and very uncertain, I don't want to say anarchy, but it was very uncertain what was going to happen, and you have nuclear weapons sitting around there, that there was an understandable concern that these weapons would be appropriated by terrorists and be pilfered and used for nuclear blackmail or terrorism or any sort of any number of very unpleasant situations. And so there was an understandable desire to ensure that these nuclear weapons were secured. But these were, a lot of these were located on what was then, what had been created as Ukraine, the country of Ukraine, an independent country. And so there was the dilemma, okay, so these nuclear weapons that were part of the Soviet Union, which is no more, they are now in Ukraine. And so what is going to be the disposition of these weapons and how they were secured? You made that point, Jim, previously, that it wasn't like they were just sitting there in a coffee shop. They were secured, but what was going to be the long-term future of these weapons? And so there was a agreement that was struck and to transfer the Soviet-era nuclear weapons from Ukrainian territory to the Russian, what was then now the Russian Federation, which was the what they formed after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the signatories to this were Ukraine, the Russian Federation, the United States of America, and the United Kingdom. They were the signatories to this Budapest Memorandum. Now, as you can guess, just from a little bit of snippet of history that I gave you, the Ukrainians were probably a little bit worried about being invaded again and about being, taken over specifically by their eastern neighbor. And so there was a lot of concern about this. So they asked, understandably, for a security guarantee from the United States. They said, can you, a guarantee, which is just like what it describes, like a guarantee. What they got was a somewhat weaker language that was still contractually and politically binding. Security assurances to respect its independence and sovereignty, which guaranteed its existing borders. So they committed to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine, which sounds like a definitely maybe. It sounds like me trying to get a date after I finished grad school, asking a girl out, definitely maybe turned into a no, right? Too late now, you had your chance, I'm married, I'm off the market. But you had your chance. But yeah, so that's what they got, and of course Russia was the signatory to this, right? And so what we're finding out now, and you made this point, Jim, is that what is that guarantee, what is that commitment worth? We're all defining that now, and you had a way of you phrased it last time, but, we're all finding out what is this commitment worth? And are we defining that now, still, 2.5 years into this? What's your,
So if you think about it, and can everyone hear me? Okay, good. If you think about it, why was America worried about nuclear weapons getting out? Because the first nuclear terror act was not going to be in Kiev or Odessa. It was going to be in Washington or New York. And the Ukrainian government, I think they made a good choice for themselves too, but it was not an easy choice. They made a choice to be a non-nuclear state and to rely on the guarantees of other countries, including us, for their security, for their independence, for their territorial integrity. And they are really the best example of a country that has said, we don't want nuclear weapons. We believe that the world community, that the Western democracies, that America will make sure we stay secure. And so they trusted this formula that we came up, which is a security assurance. Not quite the security guarantees that we give to our NATO allies. But today, America is, well, actually in 2014, was when Russia grossly violated the Budapest Memorandum by invading Crimea. And the United States at that point completely forgot about security assurances. When Ukraine asked the US for support, there was a process that was centralized at the White House. And the biggest question was, what will Putin think about this? Not what will Ukraine need, or how can it defend itself, or how can we meet our moral obligation, but how do we give Ukraine things that Putin won't mind? And so we ended up with things like blankets and meals ready to eat and other things that have absolutely no or limited military use. We told the Ukrainians not to fight over Crimea. And to me, and I'm not, I was a diplomat. I did not run our press office. I ran the practical cooperation. But to me, I had never used this word publicly before, but straight out of the BBC, I said America's position is a position of moral cowardice. And it was. Now, we have stepped up better now to meet this obligation, to meet people who gave up their protection so that we wouldn't have to worry about nuclear terrorist attacks. That should count for something. I think there are actually other stories from earlier from Ukraine, and I won't go into them now, where Ukrainians, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, people who were guarding their weapons did things to prevent war that kept us safe. So I do think that the memorandum, that they have a right to ask us the question about that, and we have a responsibility to answer. And we have answered well. We've answered decently, better than we did in 2014, but we still haven't really answered with moral courage. We're in the gray zone between moral cowardice and moral courage right now.
John, you had also made a great point in terms of the possible longer-term implications of the U.S. not living by Budapest Memorandum obligations. So if you're thinking about other countries that are looking at watching this happen, and then what conclusions are they making now about their future security, and what message is being sent?
Well, I kind of wanted to share, particularly with this audience, a little bit about what got me over there in the first place, and I'll tell that very briefly. All of us up here are Cold Warriors. All of us up here were serving in the military during the midst of the Cold War. I was actually in East Berlin for the final parade of the East German Army. So I was there at the end, at the almost end. In fact, the group of guys that I was with, we went over to observe, as intelligence officers, went over to observe the final parade, and then we came back to West Berlin, and then went back over like 2 days later to drink beer. And because it was really cheap using West Berlin. But we were back over in East Berlin, and we were in U.S. uniform. That was our requirement. We had to be wearing Class A uniforms to go to East Berlin. And we were in East Berlin. We saw the demonstrations beginning to gather around that famous church in East Berlin that eventually led to the fall of the wall. So to step forward though into 2022, at our church we were studying the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now some of you may know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor in 1930s Germany. He was opposed to what the Nazis were doing with his country, but he had an opportunity to go to the United States to study, so he went to the United States for a couple of years to study. He could have stayed in the United States, but his friends and colleagues were writing him about what was going on in Germany. So he made the decision to go back to Germany and join the resistance. And he did so, was eventually arrested, and was executed just before the end of the war. But while he was in prison, he was able to write several things. And one of the things that he wrote was that to see evil and do nothing is evil itself. God will not forget. And that was the thing we were studying in February of 2022 at our church. And so I was taken by that, and I was of course glued to the phone or the social media watching what was happening in Ukraine. So I just kind of wanted to share that with you, particularly with this audience, is that was part of the reason that motivated me to find something that I could do. And I saw a video of them taking apart an aircraft bomb, and I said, they're not doing that right. and I can help with that. You know, I'm not gonna go climb in a trench. I'm too old and too broken for that, but maybe I can teach. So that's what got me over there. But to answer his question, so if one of our main goals with the Budapest Memorandum was to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and if all the countries in the region are seeing us not fulfill our pledge, and they watch Russia take over Ukraine, then what would they be motivated to do to protect themselves? Get nuclear weapons, right? So in other words, it would be against exactly what our mission was, to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. All these smaller countries would be encouraged to get nuclear weapons. So there'd be more Pakistans and more North Koreas and all these different companies that develop, or countries that have developed their own nuclear capabilities. So that's exactly the opposite of what we want to see. So in order to ensure counter-proliferation, in order to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons, we need to defend Ukraine. We need to show those countries that we will stand up, that we will stand up to our security requirements in defending Ukraine. So I think that's the point of that.
I think we're probably at time now. But that's actually a good stopping point, because we really that's a great way to stop right here. Again, we appreciate you guys coming. We have some evaluation forms here. You know, if you don't mind, if you could just quickly fill those out, so that we're always trying to improve these sessions. And if there's things that you want us to improve on, or things that you want to you know, just give us some your thoughts about, you know, rating this session. So what we're going to do next time is kind of continue. We're going to go into Ukraine's independence. We're going to talk about Russia's history of trying to influence Ukraine's governance, influence their the way that they operate, and influence the way that they operate geopolitically, And then we're gonna talk about the invasion of Crimea, by Russia in 2014, and then the sort of the prelude to the full-scale invasion, which happened in February of 2022. That'll be kind of what we talk about next time. Again, thank you for coming, we really appreciate it, and we're available. Andrea has a tabletop little exhibit there about Ukraine that she'd love to take your questions, and she's got a lot of good information in there. And we'll see you guys next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.